Mr. President, thank you for doing this.
Absolutely.
You have said that you would speak candidly with President Castro about the serious differences you have with the Cuban government, particularly on human rights and on democracy. So take us inside that room today. What did you tell President Castro that needs to change here in Cuba?
Well, what I indicated to him was that for 50 years they have used American aggression or interest in regime change as the excuse for why they had to guard against dissent inside of Cuba. And as normalization occurs, as I visit here in a spirit of friendship and mutual respect, that excuse is taken away. And what I indicated to him is that we can't force changes on Cuba, but what we can do and will continue to do is to stand up for the rights that we consider to be universal. And we do that with not only those who have been adversaries in the past, but we do that with our allies sometimes as well. We think that countries work best when individuals have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to worship their God as they choose. And part of the benefit of the human rights dialogue that we agreed to is to have a regular channel in which we are advocating for and discussing these issues. So, for example, there have been a continuous wave of short-term detentions. In the view of the Cuban government, I'm sure this is an improvement than long imprisonments for people who engaged in dissent, but obviously that kind of continual harassment wears on people and chills legitimate debate. What I indicated to him, and I used myself as an example, we have protesters in front of the White House every day of the week, and sometimes with bullhorns that I can hear while I'm doing my work at night. But that's part of democracy. It's not something we should fear. And so in addition to specific cases of individuals who had been detained or held, and I was very specific with them about instances of individuals that we were concerned about, what I said more generally is that in order for Cuba to be successful, not just for the benefit of world opinion, but for the benefit of the Cubans themselves, that a loosening up and an increase in individual freedoms was going to be necessary.
But you heard President Castro late today. He said, give me a list of political prisoners and I'll release them. Will you give him a list?
Well, the truth of the matter is we've given him lists in the past, and they have responded intermittently to our engagement. And this, I think, is an example of why it was my belief that this would be a more successful mechanism for us to advance the values that we care about than an embargo and silence and no communications.
But you were in that room. Do you trust President Castro? Do you believe that he truly wants change here?
I believe that President Castro truly wants change. I do not believe that President Castro wants to upend the ruling party or the system that they have. And I think that's going to require a transition that happens over the course of the next generation of Cubans. But I do believe that as a consequence of interaction with the United States, as a consequence of more Americans traveling here, as a consequence of remittances that are providing small businesses the opportunity to get started here, that then leads to a significant change, and over time what you're going to end up seeing is a freer and more prosperous Cuba.
President Castro seemed to be defending himself, his record on human rights today, and he went further saying, I find it inconceivable that a government does not find a right to secure health care, food provision, and equal pay. What did you make of that?
Well, look, this is an argument that I think the Cubans make whenever they hear criticism for the United States. Their argument is that, okay, we may be, in your view, short on some democratic practices. On the other hand, you guys still engage in the death penalty or racial discrimination, and they'll tick off a list.
But when he says health care, does he have a point?
Well, here's the point, that we should not use our shortcomings as a way of deflecting the kinds of repression that happens here. And I've been very clear with them that we're not going to compare apples and oranges. On the other hand, what I did say, and this is a mechanism to indicate that there is a respectful interaction between our two countries, that we're happy to listen to criticisms that you have of us, as long as you're also willing to listen to the criticisms that we have of you. But if you think about today's press conference, as far as I can tell, that may be the first time that Raul Castro's ever stood in front of not just U.S. press, but also Cuban press and answered questions. And that could not have happened unless we had changed this policy. And so today itself was an exhibition of what happens when we have this kind of engagement.
You plan to meet with dissidents here.
Yeah.
Did you choose the list?
Absolutely.
Did Cuba have a hand in it?
No. We were very clear that we're going to meet with who it is that we want to meet. And we gave them a list, and I was very clear with President Castro that even if you have problems with some of them, make sure that they're not stopped from meeting with me.
And what message will you take to those dissidents?
Well, I think I'm going to be more in listening mode than anything else. I think it's very important for me to hear from them the concerns that they have and to acknowledge to them that as a consequence of our change in policy, we have an obligation and a duty to continue to bring their causes and their case to the Cuban government.
You're aware of some of the numbers, Mr. President. By some estimates, 1,400 people arrested in January alone, setting a new high, 500 of them women. In fact, the arrests are higher since you announced normalizing relations with Cuba.
Right.
Even arrests as you were arriving here in Havana. Does that concern you?
Well, it does concern me, and it's indicative of what I mentioned earlier. You're seeing fewer long-term detentions, long-term prison sentences, and more of a short-term detention, catch, release, harass, chill strategy and approach. And my view is that people have a right to express their differences. Now, one of the things I said to President Castro, and I truly believe in this, is that if they were less fearful of dissent, that not only might they be able to improve governance here, but I suspect that they could enhance their legitimacy in the eyes of the Cuban people. I mean, there are a lot of Cubans here who support the current government. There are a lot of Cubans here who don't necessarily want to import lock, stock, and barrel the U.S. model. And I told him that I think he's being self-defeating and counterproductive by the ham-handed tactics that are employed against these dissidents and civil rights groups. Better to listen, to hear them out, and he may discover that, in fact, they have something to teach him.
Will you meet with Fidel Castro?
If his health was good enough that I could meet with him, I'd be happy to meet with him, just as a symbol of the end of, or the closing of this Cold War chapter in our mutual histories. It's not clear to me what the state of his health is.
So it could happen.
I have no idea.
Let me ask you what so many Americans back home are asking us, which is, what's the bottom line here on tourism in Cuba? A lot of families want to come visit, not solely as a one-to-one exchange, but to drink a mojito, smoke a cigar, go to the beach. When do you see that happening?
Well, I think it's going to be happening very soon. The administrative changes that we made allow individuals now to come here for educational purposes. In addition, I'm about to have an entrepreneurship summit, which is another important leg in the stool of the changes that are taking place. We now have an agreement where cruise lines can travel from the United States directly to Havana. That means that people are going to be able to come the same way they do throughout the Caribbean. We have now direct U.S. flights to Cuba, which will make it much easier to travel. Starwood Hotels have just struck an agreement where they're going to be managing a number of the hotels here. And so travel by Americans, individual families to Cuba is going to be not that much more difficult than travel to other parts of the Caribbean and other parts of the region. And it's still going to be, I think, more bureaucratic than with some of these other countries, but inevitably it's going to happen. And when you think about the proximity, it took me no longer to get to Havana than it does for me to get to Miami from Washington, D.C.
Calvin Coolidge took a battleship to get here.
It took a lot longer. So I think that's going to happen. And in addition, one of the things that we're starting to see, the dinner that I had last night, that was at a privately owned restaurant where a chef who had worked overseas came back, had some savings, was able to invest in a restaurant, and now we're able to have a dinner, and they're making money, and he's hiring people. That's going to happen more frequently. Airbnb, Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, and is part of our overall entrepreneurial ambassadors that are working with the State Department to promote entrepreneurship around the world. He has already reached agreement where you're going to have 4,000 Cuban families who are able to rent out their apartments the same way that they do in New York City or San Francisco. That gives them an additional source of income. All these things increase interactions, but it also starts to build a non-state marketplace, and that creates additional freedom and resources for the Cuban people, and that's continually our goal when it comes to this policy.
But let me ask you about your political opposition back home. House Speaker Paul Ryan said right before this trip, to this day, this is a regime that provides safe harbor to terrorists and fugitives. Our trade embargo on Castro's Cuba is still intact, despite the president's attempts to undermine the embargo by executive action.
Well, keep in mind that I've got a number of Republicans who are traveling with me on this trip and who are fully supportive of my policy. This is one of the rare areas where you have not seen uniform opposition to what I do by Republicans, because they recognize that what we were doing for 50 years did not work. Now, it will probably take some time for there to be a tipping point.
But safe harbor for terrorists and fugitives?
He's incorrect about that. We specifically made a designation in terms of Cuba being a state sponsor of terrorists. That is no longer the case. There are fugitives here, and we're already engaging with the Cuban government around how we deal on a law enforcement level with fugitives, most of whom date back to the 60s, 70s, 80s. But that's a serious issue. It's one that we can deal with on a mutual basis. In fact, Cuba has been helpful to us on the law enforcement front when it comes to narco trafficking. And we specifically removed the state sponsor designation because of the evidence. And the State Department went through a very rigorous process that was well documented, and that Speaker Ryan and other members of Congress have access to.
Back home, it is spring break season. A lot of children are home with their parents, right. And we've all noticed that you brought the first daughters with you. Yeah. I'm curious what you have told them about the history that they're witnessing, because their generation will not see Cuba in the same way the rest of us do.
No, it's really interesting. Last night at dinner, we talked about why it is that Cuba occupied such a special place in the imagination of America, and trying to describe for them the Cuban Missile Crisis and how close we came to a nuclear catastrophe, trying to give them a sense of how the fear of a communist takeover in much of Latin America drove so much of U.S. policy, trying to give them a sense of both why the revolution here in Cuba obtained popular support because of the corruption and the oppression of the Batista government and the idealism early on of the revolutionaries, but also explaining to them how that revolutionary fervor can go sour and become dysfunctional, and the dangers of one-party rule or one-person rule for decades at a time. I mean, those are the kinds of lessons that are invaluable to them. It makes history live in some sense, and how they process that information is obviously going to be different than it is for me or people who are 10 or 20 years older than me. It's certainly going to be different than Cuban Americans who fled after the revolution and saw their property confiscated and separated from their families. Well, we can't entirely communicate the pain and the hardship that represented, but hopefully it gives them some historical understanding of what's going on here.
So that's your lesson for them. We saw the image of Malia helping you with Spanish, though, in Old Havana.
You know, her Spanish is much better than mine, and I'm hoping that she has a chance to get entirely fluent. One of my big regrets that I was too much of a goof off when I was in school to really perfect my Spanish. My accent is pretty good, but my vocabulary is the equivalent of a 2-year-old's, and it's one of those things I've always said to myself that I'm gonna take care of. But it turned out that during the presidency I didn't have time to take Spanish lessons.
You'll have time with Malia after.
I will.
2 more questions for you. We've talked a lot about the political climate here.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the political climate back home because it's back in the news again today. Right. You're aware that Donald Trump has predicted riots. If the Republican Party tries to stop him, if there's a contested convention saying, I think you'd have riots, I'm representing many millions of people. Predicting riots, I'm curious what you make of that.
Well, this is an issue that the Republican Party is going to have to work through. At the St. Patrick's Day luncheon that Speaker Ryan hosted, I've made very clear my view that there are boundaries to our politics that make our democracy work.
Did he cross that boundary?
I won't comment on any specific thing that Mr. Trump or anybody else said, but the point is that our democracy works not just because of the laws we have in place, but also the norms and customs that we maintain. There's an expectation that our leaders will not trumpet violence or justify it. There's an expectation that those who run for the highest office seek to represent everyone and not just some, or appeal to an us versus a them. That there is an importance for us to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. And the problem is that so many of those habits of our democracy have broken down over the last several years. One of the things that I think the Republican Party has to ask itself is, what is it that's happening? What was it that occurred over the last 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, 16 years that made a sizable number of their constituents find the sort of rhetoric that Mr. Trump is resorting to appealing? And my hope is that there's some self-reflection that takes place there. Democrats aren't immune from exaggeration. We're not immune from, I think, at times unfairly characterizing the other side or imputing the worst motives on them. But generally speaking, the leadership in the Democratic Party, those who have been responsible for passing laws or running the government, I think have tried to maintain the basic boundaries that make this country work, and we don't want to see those broken down. And I believe that there are Republicans of good faith. I know there are, because I talk to them all the time, including members of Congress right now who don't like the tone. This happened, they were concerned about the tone even before Mr. Trump arose. But if through social media and talk radio and certain television broadcasts, you start seeing wild claims taken as truth. The notion that the President of the United States is treasonous or wants to deliberately weaken America. If you start suggesting that everything is going to heck, even when the objective truth is that it's not. When you start seeing denial of basic science, as we've seen in climate change, when you start suggesting that somehow the President of the United States is not interested in dealing with terrorism in any serious way, that's different from saying, we disagree with the policy. Then what you start doing is creating a climate in which people believe this stuff. and it circulates through the internet in ways that are immune to fact-checking, and what that means is then somebody shows up and starts tweeting information that everybody can prove is wrong, but folks have been accustomed to hearing those kinds of wild claims, then they start believing it, and it creates a tinderbox.
Ignites. Let me ask you one final question. I know you're on a tight schedule here. You got to turn to the baseball game. You'll be there tomorrow night.
Right.
You changed the rules for Cuban players coming to America. They can now come play on American teams without having to denounce their Cuban citizenship. Why was that important to you?
Well, Cuba first of all, has incredible talent, but more importantly, baseball is one of those things that binds these two countries together. Cubans may be the only country on earth that are even more passionate about baseball than we are.
You could see the fields flying in over Havana.
Absolutely, and so for not just an exhibition game to take place, but also to start seeing players not having to take dangerous paths to get to the major leagues, abandon their families. I saw a story on SportsCenter about Abreu, a White Sox, so I paid special notice of that.
Yeah.
But here's a guy of immense talent who hadn't seen his son for several years because he felt the only way that he could play in the big leagues and help his family was to be separated from a toddler. That can't be the kind of policies that we want to promote. And so my hope is that this just becomes one more part of the stitching back together of the United States and Cuba. And the most important constituency in the United States for all of this is the Cuban American community, which has thrived and has been so successful that understandably has memories of enormous pain and anger and frustration towards the Cuban government, but also increasingly recognizes that they have the opportunity to serve as a bridge between our two countries and to reunite with family members. We have a number of Cuban Americans who we've brought along on this trip, many of whom previously were adamantly opposed to lifting the embargo and have had a change of heart, in part because they've been able to travel here and they've reunited with people that they hadn't seen for 30 years or 40 years. And the stories they tell, the emotions that have been evoked, and their realization that ultimately they could never fully sever ties with a place that is the soil where their families are rooted. That, I think, is going to be one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic about the possibilities of our two countries' relations improving over time. This is something that will outlive my administration. I think it will prove to be of enormous benefit to the Cuban people. It also will be something that I think Cuban Americans will embrace over time.